Hello everyone, this is Shelby with CNC Ballet, teaching my beginning pointe dancers how to sew their pointe shoes. There's two methods. You'll have been told one way to sew them. There's the double elastic crisscross, or there is the single elastic loop. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to sew the double crisscross elastics. So the materials that you're going to need is you'll need your pair of pointe shoes. And with your pair of pointe shoes, they should have given you ribbons and elastics. So they should have given you one big piece of ribbon. You're going to cut that piece of ribbon in half so you have one piece of ribbon for each shoe. If you're doing the double elastic, they should have given you two pieces of elastic. You will cut that into 4 pieces of elastic so that you will have 2 pieces of elastic for each shoe. Like so, you have 2 pieces to make your crisscross. You will also need thread, a needle, a pencil for marking, and scissors. I also like to use a thimble. It just protects my fingers while I'm sewing. When you're sewing through really thick layers of fabric, like pointe shoes, you can just use a thimble to rest the back of the needle against, so you don't hurt your fingers quite as bad while you're sewing. Not necessary. I really like it. The first method for ribbon placement is finding the arch of your foot. So I'll show you on my feet here. The arch of my foot is about right here. You can kind of see my foot comes up and down. There's the arch. If I point it, again, you can see I've got kind of a line here and a line here. There's my arch. I'm going to mark it with this pen. There's my arch. And the other foot, there is my arch. Now we're going to transfer that to the shoe. So I'm going to take my ribbon, put my ribbon around my foot. I'm going to take my pointe shoe and slip it on with my ribbon still around my foot. Then I can see to line my ribbon up with the mark I put on my foot. And now I'm going to transfer that mark to my shoe. I'll use a pencil, come and put a mark and a mark. So now I can see on my shoe where I am going to sew my ribbon. Here are my marks that I put for my ribbon using my arch. If you don't feel comfortable finding your arch on your foot, you don't feel confident, aren't certain that you've got the right spot, there is another way you can do it. You can go to the bottom of the sole here, the bottom of the heel, and fold it up like so. And then where the heel reaches on the sole, that will be where you place your ribbon. And then just pull it to the side. And where it ends up on the shoe, you could also place marks there. Here and here to use for your ribbon placement. Now that we've marked where our arch goes on our shoe, we're going to sew our ribbon on. So I'm going to take my ribbon and find the middle of it. And I'm going to put the middle of my ribbon in the middle of my shoe, and then take one side to each side of the shoe and line it up with our marks for our arch. Next, get your needle and thread. Tie a knot at the end. Now that we've got our needle and thread, we're going to sew our ribbon onto our shoe in a triangle shape. I'll draw it for you. So starting underneath the piping for your drawstring, you're going to sew in a straight line the width of the ribbon, and then down to a point and back up, making a triangle shape. Hopefully you can see my markings in the video. See that triangle that I drew? We're going to sew in that triangle shape. We're going to start at this corner, sew across, down and back up, and we're going to sew it twice. We're going to sew across, down and back up again. Now you'll always want to start your sewing from the inside of your shoe coming out so that we hide our knot on the inside. You don't want your ugly knot poking out on the outside of your shoe. So our first stitch is going to come from the inside, going through both the ribbon and your shoe and avoiding the drawstring piping. And you're just going to sew in and out across the top. Okay, now I've sewn across the top. I'm going to sew diagonally down to my center point. And now I'm going to sew diagonally back up to where I started. Okay, now that I'm back to where I started, there's a way I like to sew this. You don't have to do it this way, I just do it because I think it looks nice. Because you can see there's points where my stitches are on this side of the shoe, and there's points where my stitches are on the inside of the shoe, and they kind of alternate. My second time around, I like to have my stitches go the opposite direction, so I fill in the gaps between these stitches. That doesn't really matter. I just do it because it looks nice. So if you want to do it my way, the second time through, you want your needle to be going the opposite direction from before. So on my first stitch, you can see my knot there. I had my needle coming from the inside of the shoe to the outside of the shoe. The second time, I'm going to come through that exact same hole that I made for that stitch, but now I'm going to come from the outside to the inside, so then I fill in the gaps between these stitches. Again, I just do this because it looks nice. If you don't want to worry about it, just sew around the triangle a second time to make it secure. Okay, hopefully you can see I've got my alternating stitching going around in the triangle, so I have continuous stitches going all the way around. And same thing on the inside. You can see my stitching all the way around the inside. They should give you 2 long pieces of elastic. Yours will be pink, mine are white because I'm just using what I have at home. But with your pointe shoes, they should give you pink ones. So the way this is going to work is 1 piece of elastic is going to go with each shoe. So I'm going to set aside my second one for now. And I'm going to take this one and I'm going to cut it into 2 pieces. So fold it in half and I'm going to cut here. Okay, now I'm going to take this piece of elastic and I'm going to sew it on top of my ribbon that I've already sewn. So on the inside of the shoe, on top of your existing ribbon, I've still got my needle and thread attached to my ribbon where I just sewed it on. And I'm going to put it on my shoe, covering up my little triangle that I sewed. so it'll be coming in just a little bit. Okay, now I've got my needle and thread on the outside of my shoe, and I'm going to have it come from the outside of the shoe, through the ribbon, through my elastic to the inside. Here's where your thimble can come in handy because you're sewing through a lot of layers and it can really be a fight to get the needle to go through all those layers. So having a thimble to push so you don't hurt your fingers so bad can be very nice. Okay, now I'm going to sew this just like I sewed my ribbon, just going in and out in a bar across the shoe. I want my stitching to end up just underneath this little bit of piping around your shoe. On your very last stitch, you want to come from the outside of the shoe to the inside. So you want to end with your needle and thread on the inside, like so. And now I'm going to secure this little flap. I'm going to secure this little flap that I have by doing a little loop stitch around. The way I do that loop stitch is I'm going to come and I'm going to just catch a little bit of my shoe fabric and then have it go through the elastic. So you can see my needle has caught my shoe and my elastic, and I pull it through. And you're going to do that same thing again. I'm going to come down a little bit from my first stitch, and I'm going to catch the shoe, catch the elastic. Again, shoe and elastic, and through. And you're going to continue that stitch down this side, across the bottom. Across the bottom, you're going to be catching your ribbon rather than the shoe, and that's okay. So doing the same stitch, catching the ribbon and the elastic across, and then the same thing up this side, catching the shoe and the elastic back up to where we started. Now that I've done my loop stitch around back up to where I started, I'm going to do the same double alternating stitch across the top like we did on our ribbon. Again, going in where your needle would have previously come out and out where it would have previously come in, so that we fill in these little gaps between our stitches. And again, just a reminder that as you're sewing this on, try not to catch your drawstring. We want all of this stitching to be going beneath the piping that holds your drawstring, because if you have stitching going through it and it catches your drawstring, it'll make it so that it'll hold it in place. It'll sew your drawstring in place, and you don't want that. You want your drawstring to be able to slide around in its little pocket. Okay, now that we've sewn both our ribbon and our elastic on, we'll finish off by tying a knot. And after you've tied a good knot, I would recommend tying 2 or 3 knots, so you know it's solid, you don't want this coming undone. Then you can trim it. Okay, and then you'll repeat the same thing on the other side of your shoe. So Again, just make sure it's going in a straight line across. Your foot's going to be stepping on top of this here, so this needs to go along the bottom of the shoe, around and up to the other side. And again, you'll do the same thing. You'll sew your ribbon on in a triangle shape, going across and down and then back up. And then you sew it double. If you can work out the alternating stitches, it looks nice, but not super important. Just make sure you go around it twice, across, down, and up. At the end of sewing your ribbon on, make sure your needle is on the outside of the shoe. So I'm going to do one more stitch coming from the inside to the outside. Needle and thread on the outside. Now we're going to sew our other elastic on. So you are not sewing the elastic that's already attached to the shoe. You're sewing the other piece of elastic that we set aside on. And we're doing the same thing. We're laying it on the inside of the shoe on top of the ribbon that we already sewed on, covering up our little triangle stitches, and then we sew it in a straight line across, in and out. When you get to the end of sewing that, you want your needle on the inside of the shoe. So we're going to do one more stitch coming from the outside to the inside. And then we start doing, oops, sorry, I've got my thread tangled around my ribbon. It does that. You'll be fighting for your life the whole time. Now we're going to start doing our loop stitches to tack down this little flap. And after you loop stitch around, you stitch a second time across the top. Last stitch goes from the outside to the inside, so when you tie a knot, the knot's hidden on the inside of your shoe. And then trim your thread off. So at this point, in our crisscross elastic demonstration, we've got our ribbon sewn on, one piece of ribbon sewn on both sides, with two pieces of elastic sewn on top of it. So now you're going to want to measure these elastics to make them the length you want. You'll put your foot in your shoe, and you're going to take your elastic and have it go over the top of your foot and around, and it's going to attach on the back of the shoe, and it's going to go on either side of this seam here. So I'm going to show on the outside. It's going to go on the inside here, but its placement is going to be on either side. Shoe on the foot, take your elastic across and around to the opposite side. It's going to be getting sewn here. Okay, I've got it pretty snug. I'm not cutting off my blood circulation, but it is going to hold this very securely on my foot. And I'm going to mark where the top of my shoe falls on that elastic. So now I know where I want to sew it. We'll do the same for the other. It's coming from the outside of my foot across to the inside. I'm pulling it pretty snug. And again, I want it to come on the side of that seam. And I'm going to draw. Let's see if I can get this right. I'm going to draw a line. Now that you have your mark, cut an inch below it. Do not cut on the mark. And since we drew that line where it went with the top of our shoe, again, we put it there, and that's where we're going to sew it. Knot goes on the inside of the shoe. So we start with our needle on the inside, poking through to the outside. And we're sewing below our drawstring piping. We want our last stitch to end up on the inside. And just like before, we've got this flap of elastic that we want to tack down. So again, you do loop stitches along these three sides. And just like before, we're going to sew one more time across the top. On the last stitch, get your needle on the inside of the shoe and then tie a knot. Turn your thread. And we do the same thing for our second elastic. You can see our mark, trim about an inch below it. Put it to one side, put it to the other side of this heel seam. Line up your mark with the top of the shoe and sew it on. And my last knot. So at the end, this is what you should have for crisscross elastics. Don't worry about trimming your ribbons. In class, I will teach you how to tie your ribbons, and then we will trim them to the right length. And don't mess with your drawstrings either. I will help you adjust your drawstrings in class.